Hi students, welcome to lesson number 30 on conflict perspective. Let's have a brief introduction. Conflict theory is based largely on the writings of Karl Marx, who believed that class conflict is the foundation of society. Class conflict comes out because people are divided into different classes according to their conditions in the economic system. Modern conflict theory, which is associated with such sociologists as 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 and 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧, does not simply focus, as Marx did, on class conflict. It sees conflict between many other groups and interests as fact of life in any society. The assumptions of the conflict perspective are different from functionalist perspectives. Conflict theorists assume that societies are in a constant state of change in which conflict is a permanent feature. Conflict does not necessarily imply outright violence. It includes tension, hostility, competition and disagreement over goals and values. It is a constant process and thus an inevitable part of social life. Conflict theorists do not see social conflict as a necessary destructive force, although they admit that it may sometimes have that effect. They argue that conflict can often have positive results. It binds groups together as they pursue their own interest, and the conflict between competing groups focuses attention on social problems and lead to beneficial change. A modern society contains a wide spectrum of opinions, occupations, lifestyles and social groups. On any social issue, there are some people who stand to gain and some who stand to lose. Social processes cannot be fully understood without referring to the conflict of interest, and a conflict outcome always favors the stronger party. The conflict perspective has the advantage of highlighting aspects of society that the functionalist perspective, with its emphasis on consensus and stability, tends to ignore. Now, the brief objectives. The students will be able to understand the concept, origin and types of conflicts in sociology, the contribution of major scholars and their ways, and the conflict theory as it is accepted to the modern society. Now, let us understand the origin of conflict theory. Conflict theory is reflected in the writings of different philosophers and historians, sometimes in a latent and sometimes in an open form. There are two distinct traditions of conflict theory in the classical works. The first is the power relations tradition of political philosophy in Machiavelli, Bodine, Hobbes and others have analyzed conflicts in the polity in the terms of power relationships. They have treated the state as a central object of analysis. The second is the tradition of competitive struggle in classical economics. Adam Smith, Malthus and several other economists have placed economic competition at the center of their inquiry. Conflict theory in sociology focuses upon the unequal distribution of rewards in society. C.W. Mills, Ralph Dahrendorf, Louis Koser, Herbert Marcuse, Randall Collins and Andre Gunder Frank are among the noted conflict theorists of contemporary sociology. Now, we will talk about the types of conflicts. Sociologists have identified two broad types of conflict. First one, it is the endogenous conflict. These are sources of change from within society and indicate the most common area of conflict, which may be analytically distinguished as conflict over the distribution of desirables, which means one of the primary sources of societal conflict is the differential distribution of rewards such as wealth, power and prestige within the given society. Next, it is a conflict of authority. To some sociologists, particularly Dahrendorf, the authority structure is the primary source of conflict. No organization exists without a system of authority, and the system of authority involves conflict between those who give orders and who take them. Third, it is between the individuals and the society. what is good for society is not necessarily good for individuals, for often there is a basic conflict between the interest of the two. W.L. Thomas has argued that the evolution of the individual personality is a result of a continuous struggle between society and the individuals. The other type of conflict is exogenous conflict. These are sources of change outside the society and normally fall into three categories. First one, it is the war, a state of armed conflict between different countries or different groups within a country. Second, it is cultural innovations. Intracultural transactions are a perpetual source of conflict between societal orders. Variously interpreted as boundary exchanges, cultural frontiers, westernization, modernization and the like, cultural innovations operates in a myriad of ways. Technological innovations, mass media and revolution of rising experiences, expedition of traditions and new political movements, several development sociologists have used conflict perspective in their analysis of social change in the developing societies. Next, it is the conflict of ideology. Repercussions of ideological conflicts overflow the boundaries of the nation state or society. Capitalism, democracy, fundamentalism, egalitarianism, racial determinism and similar persuasions account for periodic conflicts on international sense. Throughout the history of man, ideological conflicts have been at the root of revolution, warfare and international strife. Now, we will discuss about the contributions of Karl Marx to conflict theory. Karl Marx of 1818 to 1883. The conflict perspective derives its strength and support from the work of Karl Marx, who saw the struggle between the two classes as a major theory of history. Marx believed that human society passed through different stages of development and that each stage contained the seeds of its own destruction. However, Marx did not see history as a monotonous succession of struggles between the rich and the poor. Although the class war has always been between the oppressor and the oppressed, the leading contender in the social drama of conflict differ markedly in different historical periods. The capitalist society, however, is based in the concentration of the means of production and distribution in the hands of a few. The bourgeois use the state instrument of economic exploitation and consolidation of self-interest. Inherent in capitalist society is a tendency towards a radical polarization of classes. According to Marx, property ownership gives rise to the bourgeois and the proletariats are the workers whose labor is exploited to keep the bourgeois in power. In political terms, this was translated into a conflict between the haves and the have-nots as put forward in the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx. Now, we will understand the theory of class struggle from the viewpoint of Karl Marx. In general, Marx wanted the proletarians to revolt against the capitalists and overthrow the capitalist system. In the social productions of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations which are independent of their will, namely relations of productions appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of this relation of production constitutes the economic structure of society, that is the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure and to which corresponds definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of the man that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. At a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. then an era of social revolution begins. The changes in the economic foundation lead sooner or later to the transformation of the whole. And in studying such transformation, it is always necessary to distinguish between the material transformation of the economic conditions of production and ideological forms in which man becomes conscious of this conflict and fight it out. Just as one does not judge an individual by what he thinks about himself, so one cannot judge such a period of transformation by its consciousness. But on the contrary, this consciousness must be explained from the contradictions of material life, from the conflict existing between the social process of production and the relations of production. In broad outline, the Asiatic, ancient, feudal and modern bourgeois mode of production may be designated as epochs marking progress in the economic development of society. The bourgeois mode of production is a last antagonistic form of the social process of production, that is antagonistic not in the sense of individual antagonism, but of an antagonism that originates from the individual social conditions of existence. But the productive forces developing within the bourgeois society creates also the material conditions for a solution of this antagonism. The prehistory of human society accordingly closes with this social formation. But as a theorist and historiographer, Marx recognized a far more complex and nuanced reality as he chronicled the various historical epochs. His theory of social evolution was also predictive, as he had visualized that feudalism will give way to capitalism, such as a process that was already underway, and then it will be followed by socialism, which is an obligation of the concept of private property, where society would reach stability as all class contradictions would disappear. History tells us that this did not happen, so his theory was proved politically incorrect. Although the mentioned conflict perspective of dialectics of contradictory forces clashing to produce a third stage of stability or of new oppositions as a driving force of history, which was accepted and is the basic premise of conflict theory in sociology. But the sociological theory of conflict is essentially non-political. It neither favors communism nor capitalism or any other political ideology. The aim is to identify the various social groups and social forces that produce change and to produce a general theory of social structures and their organizations from a dynamic perspective. Now, we will discuss about 𝗳𝗏 contribution to conflict theory. 𝗳𝗏 is best known as microsociologist who played a significant role in the development of small group research. 𝗏's basic approach can be described as methodological relationism because it operates on the principle that everything interacts in some way with everything else. His essay on fashion, for example, notes that fashion is a form of social relationship that allows those who wish to conform to do so, while also providing the norm from which individualistic people can deviate. Within the fashion process, people take on a variety of social roles that play off the decisions and actions of others. On a more general level, people are influenced by both objective culture, that is the things that people produce, and individual culture, that is the capacity of individuals to produce, observe and control elements of objective culture. 𝗏 believed that people possess creative capacities that enable them to produce objective culture that transcends them. But objective culture comes to stand in reconcilable opposition to the creative forces that have produced it in the first place. Now, we will look into the primary concerns of 𝗏 to conflict theory. 𝗏 is best known in contemporary sociology for his contributions to our understanding of patterns or forms of social interaction. 𝗬𝗏 made clear that one of his primary interests was association among conscious actors, and that his intent was to look at a wide range of interactions that may seem trivial at some times, but crucially important at others. One of 𝗬𝗏's dominant concern was the form rather than the content of social interaction. From 𝗬𝗏's point of view, the sociologist's task is to impose a limited number of forms on social reality, extracting commonalities that are found in a wide array of specific interaction. Along these lines, 𝗬𝗏 attempts to develop a geometry of social relations. The crucial difference between the dyad, that is 2-person group, and triad, that is 3-person group, is that a triad presents a greater threat to the individuality of group members. In a larger society, however, an individual is likely to be involved in a number of groups, each of which controls only a small portion of his or her personality. Distance also determines the form of social interaction. For example, the value of an object is a function of its distance from an actor. 𝗬𝗏 considered a wide range of social forms including exchange, conflict, prostitution, and sociability. One of the main focuses of 𝗬𝗏's historical and philosophical sociology is a cultural level of social reality which he called objective culture. In 𝗬𝗏's view, people produce culture, but because of their ability to conceptualize social reality, the cultural world and the social world come to have their lives of their own and increasingly dominate the actors who created them. 𝗬𝗏 identified number of components of objective cultures including tools, transportation, technology, the arts, language, the intellectual sphere, conventional wisdom, religious dogmas, philosophical system, legal systems, moral codes, and ideals. The absolute size of objective culture increases with modernization. The number of different components of the cultural realm also grows. What worried 𝗬𝗏 most was the threat to individual culture posed by the growth of objective culture. Now, we will understand what is objective culture. The increasing division of labor in modern societies leads to an improved ability to create the various components of the cultural world. But at the same time, the highly specialized individuals loses a sense of the total culture and loses the ability to control it. As objective culture grows, individual culture decreases. The massive expansion of objective culture has a dramatic effect on the rhythm of life. For example, our means of communications are more efficient, meaning that slow and unpredictable communication has been replaced with readily available mail, telephone, and email services. On the positive side, people have much more freedom because they are less restricted by the natural rhythm of life. On the negative sides, problem arises because the growth of objective culture generates cultural malaise, cultural ambivalence, and ultimately a tragedy of culture. Now, we will talk about the philosophy of money as given by 𝗬𝗏. The philosophy of money, as said by 𝗬𝗏, assesses the impact of the money economy on the inner world of actors and the objective culture as a whole. 𝗬𝗏 saw money as a linked with social phenomena such as exchange, ownership, greed, extravagance, cynicism, individual freedom, style of life, culture, and the value of personality. In general, he argued that people create value by making objects, separating themselves from those objects and then seeking to overcome distance, obstacles, and difficulties. Money serves both to create distance from objects and to provide the means to overcome it. Money provides the means by which the market, the economy, and ultimately society acquire a life of their own that is external to and cohesive of the actor or the individual. 𝗬𝗏 saw the significance of the individual declining as money transactions become an increasingly important part of society. A society in which money becomes an end in itself can cause individuals to become increasingly cynical and to have a relaxed attitude. Now, we will talk about 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏𝗧's contribution to conflict theory. 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏, an American sociologist, argues that conflict is instinctual for us. So, we find it everywhere in human society. There is a conflict of war, but there is also the conflict that we find in our daily lives and relationships. There is generally something that we are trying to achieve through conflict, and there are different possible ways of reaching our goal. The existence of the possibility of different paths open up opportunities for negotiation and different types of levels of conflict. Because 𝗧𝗏 sees conflict as a normal and functional part of human life. He can talk about its variations in ways that others missed, such as the level of violence and functional consequences. He was of the opinion that conflict is inherent not just in society, but in the human persons. It is a part of our instinctual behavior as humans. He put forward the concept of absolute and relative deprivation. Absolute deprivation occurs when a human group is subject to utter lack of resources to the extent that people are barely able to survive. They lack the most basic amenities like food, drinking water, health care, housing, etc. And the concept of relative deprivation is used for those who are better off, but having some level of survival resources are able to think and compare themselves with others who are much better off. So, relative deprivation is more likely to occur when society as a whole is not too badly equipped, but there are very stark disparities between the rich and the ordinary people. As observed, people living in absolute poverty rarely engage in violence, as they simply do not have the capacity to do so. For example, we hear about people in remote rural areas suffering from starvation. Yet we never hear about such people engaging in conflict. However, as 𝗧𝗏 points out, when people make the transition from absolute to relative deprivation, the chances of conflict increases. For example, the Dalit movement began not from the rural areas, where the untouchables lived a life of bare survival and utter misery. It began from the urban industrial areas, where the rural poor had migrated as wage labor. Although they were poor and exploited, yet they had some cash income, and because as industrial labor they worked in larger groups, they were able to come together, organize under the charismatic leadership of B.R. Ambedkar. Only when they came to urban cities and became exposed to urban life, where they were able to comprehend their exploitation and reflect on their life conditions in a comparative perspective. 𝗧𝗏 also identified levels of conflict as arising from different social situations and conditions of development of conflict. When people have clearly defined goals which are both pragmatic and rational, the escalation and persistence of violence can be less likely. Since goals are clearly defined and achievable, such as high salary for workers or better living conditions for urban poor, conflict will fizzle out once the demands were met. For example, workers on strike may call up the strike. More violent and persistent levels of conflict arise if the goals are emotionally charged and transcendental. One may take an example, the prolonged conflict over religion, ethnic identities and subnationalism. Such emotionally charged and esoteric goals are unresolvable, like the persistent violence in Northern Ireland between Catholics and Protestants that is unresolvable, but often erupts into greater violence. Following the functional school of all his times, 𝗂𝗧 also identified the functional aspect of conflict by classifying conflict into two types, that is external and internal to the group. Conflict that is internal to the groups is mostly of the low intensity but frequent type, when two or more potentially hostile groups live in a close proximity to each other, whites and blacks in the USA or Hindus and Muslims in India, Protestants and Catholics in Great Britain. There is likelihood of small scale and frequent skirmishes between them. However, for most of the time, such low intensity violence can be brought under control by the internal law and order maintenance mechanism, and tensions tends to diffuse out, leading to relatively long periods of peace. The positive aspect of such small scale conflict is that it leads to better organization of administrative machinery and also to have more evolved norms of conduct. For example, frequent flare-ups between workers and management potentially damaging to the economy is controlled by improved labor laws. The external conflict likewise tends to increase internal cohesion of the group and also draw more clearly defined boundaries. As a group experiences in external conflict, the boundaries surrounding the group become stronger. The member of the group experiences greater solidarity, power is exercised more efficiently, and the group tends to form coalitions with other groups. The more violent the conflict is, the more intensified are these effects. 𝗧𝗧 has written extensively on the positive functions of social conflict. Conflict allows expression of hostility and the mending of strained relationships. It leads to the elimination of specific sources of conflict between parties and enables redress of grievance through the establishment of new norms or the affirmation of old ones. Hostility towards the out group, a community or caste unifies the in group. When the need for greater solidarity is felt, members of the in group tend to exaggerate conflicts with other groups, and where such conflict exists, any deviation from the group norm is severely condemned. Social conflict not only generate new norms and institutions, but also new coalitions and alliances. They bring about technological improvements, revitalize the economy and lubricate the social system as they facilitate the release of tension and frustration and enable the social system to adjust itself. Social conflicts and movements have often resulted in significant reforms and positive social changes. Therefore, conflict is not always or necessarily dysfunctional. Now, we will discuss about Ralph Dahrendorf's contribution to conflict theory. Like 𝗂𝗧, Dahrendorf sees conflict as universally present in all human relations. But Dahrendorf does not see the inevitability of conflict as part of human nature. He sees it rather as a normal part of how we structure society and create social order. Dahrendorf argues that it is power that both defines and enforces the guiding principles of society. He also follows 𝗂𝗧 in talking about the level of violence and its effects, but he adds an further variable, conflict intensity. His most influential work on social inequality is Class and Class Conflict in Industrial Society, which was published in 1959. This book presents his first detailed account of the problem of inequality in modern or post-capitalist societies. Dahrendorf's central argument is that neither structural functionalism nor Marxism alone provides an acceptable perspective on advanced society. He claims that structural functionalists pay too little attention to the realities of social conflict and that Marx defined class too narrowly and in a historically specific context. This historical context that Marx was writing in was one where wealth was the determining factor in power. The wealthy ruled, and there was no way for the poor to gain any power or increase their position in society. 𝗳𝗏, however, points out that the changes have occurred in society that come with democracy, like voting for political parties and increased mobility. He believes that the struggle for authority creates conflict. Now, we will talk about authority and the rulers and the ruled. The conflict theory of 𝗳𝗏 is based exclusively on the relations of authority. Authority structure, which is an integral part of every society, that is social organization, results in the creation of a dichotomy of positions of dominance and subjection. Some are entrusted with the legitimate right to exercise control over others who are subordinate to the former. This distribution of authority leads to the formation of two conflicting groups corresponding to the two positions of control and subjection, that is, those who give orders and those who take orders. 𝗳𝗏 has summarized the essential elements of conflict theories as follows. Every society is subjected at every moment to change. Social change is ubiquitous. Every society experiences at every moment some social conflict, that is, conflict exists between different elements of society. Every element in a society contributes to its change, and all elements contribute to conflict in one way or other. And every society rests on constraints of some of its members by others. So, here 𝗳𝗏 states that capitalism has undergone major changes since Marx initially developed his theory of class conflict. This new system of capitalism, which he identifies as post-capitalism, is characterized by diverse class structure and a fluid system of power relations. Thus, it involves a much more complex system of inequality. 𝗳𝗏 contends that post-capitalist society has institutionalized class conflict into state and economic spheres. For example, class conflict has been habituated through unions, collective bargaining in the court system, and legislative debate. 𝗳𝗏's theory often took the opposite view of functionalist. Conflict theory said that every society at every point is subject to the process of change. So, he believes that there is dissension and conflict at every point in the social system, and many societal elements as contributing to disintegration and change. They believe order comes from coercion from those at the top. They believe that power is an important factor in social order. 𝗳𝗏 believes that both conflict theory and consensus theory are necessary because they reflect the two parts of society. Consensus theory focuses on the value integration into society, while conflict theory focuses on conflicts of interest and the force that holds society together. Despite these stresses, 𝗳𝗏 wanted to understand how conflict works. He did not believe the two theories could be combined and focused on developing the conflict theory. 𝗳𝗏's thesis was the differential distribution of authority invariably becomes the determining factor of systematic social conflicts. He makes a broad division between the command class and obey class, and class conflict would then refer to the conflict between those with authority and those without authority. But the drawback of this proposition is that social classes would exist in particular situations only as some people may be in authority in some places and may not be in another. Moreover, social classes will be present although society and cease to have a structural relevance. Thus, structural and static notion of hierarchy. 𝗳𝗏 preferred to use the term strata and regard class as a dynamic phenomena of real society. To sum up, conflict theory is largely a synthesis of two traditions with primary focus on unequal distribution of rewards in society. Karl Marx is his leading architect. George Simmel, Dahrendorf, Louis Koser, Herbert Marcuse, Randall Collins and Andre Gunder Frank are among conflict theories of contemporary sociology. Conflict theory tend to be specific, restricted to the interrelationship between two or more units within society. Racial tensions, class war, religious conflicts, strikes, protest, student power movements, revolutions, peasants' uprisings become subjects of analysis. Karl Marx and Dahrendorf represents macro-level conflict theorists, and the conflict theories assume that society are in constant stages of change in which conflict is a permanent feature. Conflict does not necessarily imply outright violence. It includes hostility, severe competition and disagreement over goals and values. Conflict is not deemed here as occasional event that disturbs the smooth functioning of the society. It is regarded as a constant process and an inevitable part of social life.